Welcome everyone to the Computer History Museum. Here in the audience, thanks for coming on another cooling but still hot day. A little bit of, and those online, we're streaming this live, and of course it'll be part of the permanent archive. Welcome everyone. Tonight is a really interesting and special night relative to the mission of this institution. And I'm really pleased to say that David Yarnold is here to discuss with us his new book, The Geography of Hope, Real-Life Stories of Optimists Mapping a Better World. Those online can be anywhere in the world, as we know. And one of the beautiful things about this book and the story and the technology, the GIS technology, which goes back to public-private partnerships, is that it really does manifest itself in the mission of this institution, the Computer History Museum. We also like to say CHM can stand for Computing, Humanity, and Meaning. And then the fundamental question is, what is life without computing these days? In fact, life doesn't exist without computing. And it's the location-based services and things that have created both the opportunity, the promise, and the peril, which of course is, the future implications of computing on the human condition, which is, again, part of our mission and purpose. So the program really does manifest itself in the heart and soul of the mission. Let me now take a moment to introduce tonight's speakers. David Yarnold has an incredible history working as the primary photographer as well as writer of this book. He was most recently the CEO of the National Audubon Society, amazing institution that brought together both sides of the aisle around wetlands and the environment, which is really very powerful. He was involved with the Environmental Defense Fund and helped work with the Chinese government on carbon trading issues and things of that ilk. He was also the executive editor of the San Jose Mercury News, where he was a Pulitzer Prize-winning editor, and beyond that, an award-winning photojournalist and designer, which you'll see in the book as well. I'm particularly gratified to make the point, too, that David is a trustee of the museum. He joined shortly after I started about 7 years ago, and has made major contributions, been helping the museum quite a lot. He's got great experience both in the nonprofit world, but also in the use of technology and covering it for so long. Moderating the chat tonight will be Don Garcia, who directs Stanford's John S. Knight JSK Journalism Fellowships Program, helping journalists around the world tackle world's most urgent problems. She began her career as a reporter and editor in West Coast newspapers, including the Mercury News with David and the San Francisco Chronicle. She's on the board of KQED and the Journalism Women's Symposium and Open News. And before the program begins, David is going to do a little setup. I'll invite him to the stage up front so he can sort of set the stage for the moderated conversation. So please join me in welcoming David to the stage.
Thanks, Anna. Hi, everybody. I want to thank the Computer History Museum for this opportunity. I want to thank my publisher, Esri, and I want to invite all of you here and online to come visit the Computer History Museum. It's a ton of fun and help support it. Before we get started, we're going to do a little level setting. We're going to do a survey for those of you who have the QR codes. And here's the survey. The question is, how familiar are you with Geographic Information Systems, or GIS? And so you can take a minute and do that. Should just be a category on here for serious map geek, because I hang out with a lot of serious map geeks now. So, okay. What's GIS is gaining and everything. So, Detran, a friend and longtime colleague at the Mercury News, said that I should announce in advance that there will be no fact-checking tonight. Okay, so that's a pretty interesting representation. You actually know more than most of the world does. So I'm going to move into my presentation. This is the book, this is the subtitle. My GIS Spark story happened when I was the CEO of Audubon. I was asked to find a vision that could unify all of Audubon, and we decided that we were going to protect the most important places for birds and people. And the way we did that was by using GIS technology to locate them on maps. And invariably, when you use GIS technology, that takes you to a user conference in San Diego where 15,000 map geeks get together every year. I think for 10,000 of them, it's better than the holidays. And it was at one of these conferences sponsored by Esri. You'll hear that name. I'll explain that. They're the dominant provider of GIS software in the world. And it was at one of these conferences in 2015 where Dr. Bruce Aylward from the World Health Organization talked about how he used mapping to help end Ebola. And his story took my breath away. And it stayed with me until 2022, when I woke up one day and said, I want to write a book about the people who use GIS to change the world. Because I had heard their stories at these user conferences for more than a decade. And they were just fascinating. And a book like this hadn't been done, telling the story of this technology through people. Esri said yes. And we find ourselves here today. So let's do a real quick step back on what GIS is. I'm going to oversimplify this and make it painless. And for those of you who know more than I do, well, you can help me later on. But here at its essence on the left-hand side is what GIS is. You start with a photograph or a map, and you layer data on top of it. So how might this work? Let's say that that very bottom layer is a map of the Bay Area. And let's say that next layer of data is about rainfall. And the next layer is about wildfires. And the next layer is about demographic information, income. The next layer is about how many homes have basements? And when you take all of those layers and you put them together, what you see are gaps and opportunities in lots of different ways that we'll talk about. In this specific case, we're talking about homeowners insurance. And this is at the heart of the fight between the insurance companies and the state of California, and why you all wonder whether you're going to be able to have insurance and how much it'll cost. Because this is exactly what the insurance companies want to be able to use. The maps on the right are what every GIS team knows about any city. It's what's under the ground, where there's noise, where the subway stops are. This is also a GIS tool. It's a dashboard. The city of Berkeley has the most transparent reporting system in the country, according to the experts I talked to. Every use of force is recorded and updated almost instantly in the city of Berkeley. And it's all part of a much bigger story about police reform. I went to the city of Prague because they have a very large GIS team. And I wanted to see what they knew about a city that has, it's a city of contradictions. How many of you have been to Prague? Right, it's lovely, right? Dense, the red roofs. It's a World Heritage Site, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's also a vibrant tech hub for Europe. How do you manage all of that? And what I found when I went to Prague is what happened everywhere. Everywhere I went, and with every chapter, I was surprised. I didn't find the story I expected. In Prague, it turns out that we knew that they're only 3.5 decades past the fall of communism, and it turns out there are plenty of people who want to do the public's business behind closed doors. And the folks I went to see and the organization they run, they bring 50,000 people a year through their institute to help plan the Prague of the future. The mayor says that GIS planning is so important to Prague, he called it the life water of Prague. I thanked him for the chapter title. Similarly, there's a story about democracy in Bakersfield, California, historically one of the most racist places in the state. And this is a story about redistricting and about political power. Across Africa, there's a movement for conservation to be done for and by Africans, as opposed to the post-colonial version of conservation that threw 14 million Africans off of their lands. Deeply moving, profound story, and a place where development and conservation has to happen hand in hand, something that mostly doesn't go well. But given the fact that by 2100, 40% of the people on Earth are going to be Africans, they really have to get this right. And I met Fortu Msofe, Dr. Fortunata Msofe. She's responsible for all things wildlife in Tanzania. She started as a park ranger. This was a chapter that people told me I couldn't do. A chapter about the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. How many of you know that there's a National Geospatial Intelligence Agency? There's a few hands. I'd love to know your backgrounds. So they make all of the maps for all of the branches of the military. Every boat driver, every pilot has an NGA-produced map. They make the maps for all of the intelligence agencies. Their history is really extraordinary, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And the stuff they know. Remember that Chinese balloon, that Chinese spy balloon that crossed the US, and it happened in the dead of summer when CNN needed something to lead every day with, right? So NGA knew where it was. NGA had a picture of it on the ground, thanks to one of its partners, in the middle of China. That's it in the middle of that runway. They knew where it was all along. I encountered stories that turned in ways that I didn't expect. As a privileged Westerner, I set out to do a chapter about removing explosives. Half of the world's countries have explosives left over from civil wars or external wars. What I didn't expect to find was this deep human yearning to go home again. This is Helmand Province in Western Afghanistan. The picture on the left, see how there's nothing inside most of those white lines? Well, there is something there. It's a minefield, and it's massive. 10 years after the mines were removed, there were schools, there were shops, there were 50,000 people living there. That's the picture on the right. People just want to go home again. This chapter turned out to be a hot button. I wasn't expecting this. This chapter is about the insurance industry and what it knows about us. It turns out that the insurance industry has mapped, imaged, virtually every square inch of the continental United States and Hawaii. What do they know about your backyard? They know the condition of your roof. They know about your fence. They know if you've got one of those trampolines that you didn't tell the insurance company about. And how do they know this? Because they have fleets of planes that fly over major metro areas twice every year. I flew with them over New York and Connecticut. This picture is from the pilot's iPad. And when I told the head pilot that I'd like to fly with them, he said, "Well, you can if you want." He said, "The first 15 minutes is pretty interesting. The rest of it's like being in a Zamboni in the sky." So, which it pretty much was. So that's a brief intro to give you a sense of what's in the book. I'm looking forward to the conversation with Dawn, and I'm looking forward to introducing you to these optimists who are mapping a better future. So, Dawn, come join me, please. Thanks.
So I'm Dawn, and I'm a map geek. I'll say it loud, say it proud. In fact, there's a few people here from my program at Stanford this afternoon. We were at the David Rumsey Map Center. So I'm having a double mapping kind of day today. So David, I want to talk to you about your book and about the journey of your book. So you talked about meeting this world of GIS practitioners. So what was it about them and about GIS that you really wanted to write most about? Why did you do this?
It's so ubiquitous. It is so everywhere. Almost every government in the United States uses it. Most police departments, most fire departments, most big businesses, most big nonprofits, any environmental organization. And it was extraordinary to me that there was all of this technology that people just aren't aware of. And I had heard these stories at the user conferences. I remember these cheesesteak-loving Philadelphia cops who talked about how they caught a robber in the act because they mapped his MO, and they knew where he was and what time of day. I remember stories about building ports in Europe, and I remember stories about how Old Navy decided where to put their stores by layering all of that data. And there's something about maps, and I ask people this question all the time. Maps have this sort of grace space where people are willing to meet over maps and believe in them. And I think that's because people have always wanted to know where they are in relation to other people and what might happen to the place they're in. And so maps just have this sort of this special place in the world that we don't give a second thought to. Somebody said, and as somebody who was trained as a visual journalist, the idea that a picture is worth 1,000 words and a map is worth 10,000 pictures. And
that could work. So in writing this book, there were things that you probably expected, and then there were things that surprised you. So I want to know about the surprises.
I was surprised by how the chapters connected with each other. So the first time the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency made a database public was during Ebola. And all of a sudden those chapters intersected. And that's because, and I learned this during the course of the book, and you know, this is just being a Westerner. So much of the world is unmapped. So there were very few maps of the 3 Western African countries where Ebola was prevalent. And so the chapters touch that way. And a tool was developed for Ebola to input data from the field. And then that tool appeared in the chapter in policing and in the chapter in explosives removal too. So there were all of these connections. But the chapter that surprised me most was Prague. And it took a couple of days for people to let down their guards before they would actually talk about the fact that there were people who wanted to do them political harm. They wanted to cut their budgets, they wanted to terminate them, they wanted to just shut down the transparency that they had brought to the city of Prague. And we have a video from the director of the Institute talking about how he helped the people of Prague come to trust their government more.
Okay, let's watch.
Citizens and also sometimes businesses didn't know exactly why politicians and officers make the conclusions which they make, because they didn't have the same information background. And what we did, how we change it, we make the application which were normally used or previously used just for the city, we make it public. and then the citizens see on which background, what is the reason for the conclusions or output which city makes. And really, it really limited the number of discussion about the facts in the city.
So that's Jiří Števroky, and he's the head of the Institute for Planning and Development's GIS division. And the thing about Prague is that it's notorious, and the Czech Republic is that it's pretty corrupt. There was a big gang bust there while I was writing the chapter. And they have real reason to fear for their jobs. And the fact that they combat that with transparency was really a remarkable story.
It's a lot of courage
Yeah.
for them to do that.
Yeah.
So shifting gears a little bit, one of the things that I saw in your book that emerged in several chapters as a theme was community engagement, and this is something that I think we both care a lot about. Was that intentional? Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Was that theme intentional? And tell us more about those chapters.
Yeah, it's a good question. So it was intentional when I did the Bakersfield chapter because GIS has gone through an evolution. So let me talk for just a second about Esri because they're my publisher and they run this user conference.
And what does Esri stand for?
Earth Science Research Institute, but nobody knows that. They're just called Esri. And they were started by a husband and wife team 55 years ago. And GIS was really hard to use for a very long time. Everybody was inspired and they had a great idea, but they were using floppy disks or worse, and it was really, really hard. And what really changed was when everything went to the web in 2010, 2011, which is when I met it at Audubon. And what changed was the idea of community mapping. So it went from being something that wizards in closets did to being something that anybody could do around a table. And it completely changed the dynamic and opened it up and made it a shareable tool. Community engagement turned out to be a theme in the chapter about Africa because we were talking with landowners about planning at the local level. I heard stories from the head of the African Wildlife Foundation, Kadu Sabunya, about how he would meet with leaders of African nations with maps in hand. And he was fairly unabashed about talking about how African leaders trusted African conservation organizations more, and was fairly candid about that, and that's in the chapter. But it was in Bakersfield, which was a minority-majority community, but virtually every elected board was populated by white people. And it was there in 2021 where a redistricting story unfolded. And I'd like to share a video with you.
Please do.
So this is Sophia Garcia. She's part of a father-daughter team that both worked on redistricting. And when we were talking about chapters, I heard father-daughter team. And the journalist in me said, "Ooh, that sounds like a good hook." Well, Sophia was working for Redistricting Partners, a consultancy at the time. And it turned out she couldn't even talk to her dad about this because they had to be independent because they reported to the city. And her dad was working with the Dolores Huerta Foundation.
Oh, yeah.
And so Sophia talks about what happened in Bakersfield because it was pretty monumental, as she'll explain.
And instead of like a static map, it really is a way of thinking. It's a way of kind of creating, getting to policy change or getting to informed decision-making based on looking at data visually. I was the consultant for the city of Bakersfield. I work for Redistricting Partners. And as a consultant during the 2021 cycle, we worked with close to 100 jurisdictions. And the city of Bakersfield was the only jurisdiction-only customer that moved forward and voted on a community-led map. What had to come together to make this a really wonderful community-led map was a Venn diagram. So we think of having the community that was educated and came forward, we had the software that was available and accessible. And then we also had the council that was ready to move forward. Part of that was under a new California law called the Fair Maps Act.
Can you say a little bit more about that interview and about what that meant? What did her discussion there on what happened?
So California has a law called the Fair Lines Act, and every 10 years, cities have to redistrict. Every entity has to redistrict. And it was Bakersfield's turn, and the city council put it off as long as they possibly could, and then there was just too much community pressure. And over time, what happened was that a district was carved out that created another large Latino and Sikh community district. And what happened, I don't mean to give away the chapter, but it's...
Well, you got to say a little bit, David.
A little bit. The Bakersfield City Council, which Bakersfield was had one of the most active KKK chapters during the 20s and 30s, something I didn't know and embarrassed to admit as a Californian. And a lot of that has persisted. And because they were able to redistrict, the hope is that there's a district in Bakersfield that's split by Highway 99. Some of you might remember that before I-5. That will have a chance now for clinics and sidewalks and things that the rest of the city has had for a long time. And so the Bakersfield City Council flipped in Kevin McCarthy's home district.
Ooh. So maps matter.
They created a thing called the Unity map, right? Like, how unheard of is unity these days, right?
Yeah. I want to remind the audience there's going to be time for questions after David and I finish our conversation. Please don't be shy. Please submit your questions. I'm going to get them here on this trusty little iPad, and we'll answer your questions and have a chance to do that. So please use the little QR code slide up, and we'll be happy to answer those. So one of the things that I think people don't know, well, many things about GIS, but about how businesses are using GIS. And you decided to focus on a business that I wouldn't have necessarily thought. You had a little preview there in your slides, in the insurance industry. So why the insurance industry, and what other industries should we know about that are using GIS that are going to affect us?
I knew that I wanted, so a word about Esri and GIS. A lot of time and attention is focused on nonprofits and universities, academia. Esri is privately held, and they reinvest 30% a year in R&D, and they have given away software to 10,000 nonprofits, and they did with Audubon. But I knew that I wanted to write a chapter about for-profits because people make lots of money with GIS. I have a friend who I was talking to about GIS, and most of my friends don't know, and they got tired of me talking about it. But this guy was a hedge fund guy, and he said, oh yeah, we buy fiber. We're all about fiber and taking it to homes, and we know what the last mile looks like now. We know whether we have to cross sidewalks. We know exactly where that last mile goes. We used to have to believe the marketing guys. And when people use GIS, they make a ton of money off of it. So the insurance industry, I was just browsing through some videos from Esri's big plenary sessions, and they have one in DC that's mostly for government. And I came across this guy from this consortium talking about how they flew over every inch of America and took pictures. And I was like, you do what? And so, and it is a consortium that lots of insurers and reinsurers are a part of. And the gains that they get out of that, not only not only are they able to assess damage without sending out appraisers, Brit Insurance told me that the third biggest insurer in Lloyd's of London told me that they cut their cost of damage appraisal from $13,000 a head to $8 a head, just because they didn't have to send somebody out, put them up at a hotel, fly them on an airplane. So the insurance industry is flipping, and that chapter ends with a startup here called Geosite, and I had an opportunity to spend time with that team and Rachel Olney, their CEO, and they provide GIS services to insurance companies that can't afford GIS teams. But there are tons of businesses that have GIS stories. It's why FedEx and UPS try to make only right turns.
Say that again?
It's way more efficient.
Okay.
Any company that has a supply chain monitors it through GIS. And they're super, a couple of other examples. Chick-fil-A knows more about its customers than any other food company I found. Their stores yield 2.5 times what a McDonald's yields because of where they put their locations, because of what they know about their customers and their drive time, and a whole bunch of other data that they collect. They're super smart about GIS. But what was really interesting to me is how many companies said no. Nike said no, TD Ameritrade
Said no to what?
To being a part of the chapter.
Oh, to be part of your book?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And because it was like some trade secret or something, when in fact it's really GIS. But it was, the lawyers got involved, and the GIS teams wanted to talk and to tell their stories, but the lawyers said no, and that happened in lots of places. But really, any big enterprise uses GIS to figure out where to put their stores, how to track their stuff, and to know a lot about their customers.
Okay. So as a longtime journalist, sometimes there's hard things that you have to do when you're trying to figure out a story, you're trying to figure out a reporting path, a strategy. So what chapters were hard for you in this book? The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency is by nature secret. But they do a lot of disaster relief. They're on the ground in Florida now. They were, if asked and if invited, they will share maps. They'll send a portable team in that they use in war zones to help local officials do mapping, to track progress, to figure out where waters are rising. And NGA has an amazing history. It's cobbled together out of 7 other agencies. Those agencies mapped the moon landing. Those agencies published the Cuban Missile Crisis photographs. Those agencies I interviewed a 102-year-old woman named Bea McPherson, who was a military mapping maiden. I love that title.
In World War II. She worked in St. Louis, and along with 200 other women, drew maps for D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, and was just a remarkable interview. And my favorite thing about interviewing Bea was that she was dying to tell me a joke. And we go through this interview, and at the end she says, "We had a softball team. You want to know what the name was?" And I said, "Sure." She goes, "The Contours." Get it? and NGA's mission is to provide mapping and knowledge for warfighters. And it was really interesting being at one of their trade shows and hearing terminology like that, and they perform a really vital mission. The hardest part about this chapter was the fact that they face big challenges. Every day they get the equivalent from satellites and other remote sensing, they get the equivalent of 3 National Football League seasons. Every game, 3 seasons, every day. And there are a lot of questions about whether they're able to process that. There are a lot of questions about whether America's intelligence community can process everything that they see on the internet now too, right? And we know that the answer is, well, no, probably not. And in fact, there are lots of experts who think that that kind of remote sensing ought to be a separate agency. So NGA was a tough nut to crack, but they wanted their story told for a lot of reasons. They do a lot of good work, and they really need to hire really good people.
So you were able to get into it. So David, after you wrote the book, you told me, we were having a chat before this conversation, and you said you were attending an Esri user conference, and someone asked you to sign a preview copy of the Geography of Hope. And he's kind of a pretty high-profile GIS user who's now on the national stage. So audience, do you know who it might be? Think about it. It is. You're right. Okay, tell us the Tim Walls story. We want to hear.
So Tim Walls, a geography teacher, is old school GIS. He used GIS in the early 1990s when it was not easy to use GIS. And he was a keynote speaker at Esri's conference in mid-July. This picture was 2 weeks before he was asked to join the Democratic ticket. And you know when a really good marketing opportunity falls into your lap.
Tell us a little bit about Tim. What's your impression of him?
I should note that he uses GIS maps to run the state of Minnesota. Anybody can go to the state of Minnesota's map portfolio, where they're tracking everything from the school lunch program that he talks about, to flood levels, to invasive species. There's an entire portfolio of GIS maps that helps everybody in Minnesota see the same thing. And I think that's one of the things that's most profound for me as somebody who started as a visual journalist and as a designer, is the only way I know that the idea that you end up with in your head is the same idea I have in my head, is to show you. And visual journalists have a mantra: show, don't tell. Mm-hmm. And it's so that you can have that kind of certainty. And when you're in government, it matters even more. So Walls reads to me as a very smart, very earnest, salt-of-the-earth guy who is a progressive and understands what's important to people, and potentially what could have really benefited him when a presidential candidate was looking for a vice president.
That's great. That's a great story. So I think we're going to see another video.
In fact, we are. So he's a teacher. Thanks for the reminder. He's a teacher. And the chapter about education is the last chapter in the book. And I wanted to do a chapter about education, but I could only find 2 places in the world where GIS was compulsory in K-12. And so I went to England. I went to the UK. And it is remarkable seeing what happens when kids are exposed to the visual learning that GIS provides. I went into a classroom in London where these kids were literally climbing over each other's backs in the middle of this lesson to, help each other, except for one girl in the back who was tracing Taylor Swift's Eras concert tour. And I met a teacher named Jackie Black who teaches right outside of Edinburgh, and she is the best spokesperson I came across for GIS in the classroom.
Let's watch.
I'd say that teachers as a whole are probably now in a much better position to actually move forward and run with GIS than ever before, purely because, I hate to mention it, but lockdown has done a lot here. So we have huge digital skill set that we maybe didn't have as a profession before, purely out of necessity. We've also got a lot more devices in school, and the actual interface of GIS is now much simpler than it's ever been before. It's much more intuitive. I think actually the strongest example I have at the moment is a pupil that I am currently teaching. So he is a pupil with additional support needs, and he really enjoys actually looking at the map and finding out things, and he naturally asks questions. And he is now putting his hand up and asking me questions and becoming involved in whole class discussion, where he would have quite actively avoided that before.
Great.
She's pretty thoughtful and, has brought along a lot of the teachers in her school, and I think will rule the world someday. So.
We'll rule the world. Yeah, looks that way. I'd like to shift gears a bit and talk about the writing of the books. Anyone who's attempted to write a book, maybe it was easy for you. It's not easy for most people. It's a lot of research and time spent trying to figure out what path you're going to go down. And how did you decide? GIS is a pretty giant topic. So how did you decide what specific topics and angles that you were going to write about?
I needed a roadmap. And like all of our journalist friends who are in the room, it's so great to see so many Mercury News alums, something that we share. I needed deadlines. I needed to create chunks. And so what I did was I started by using the market verticals that Esri has defined for itself. I want to be really clear that while Esri published the book, they left the topics completely up to me, and I was writing about some of their biggest customers, and they changed nothing in the book. I had all the editorial autonomy that I could ask for. So I started with their market verticals. I started with big international nonprofits. That's how I ended up with the world of, it's called humanitarian demining. That's a term that Europeans understand more than Americans.
I have no idea what that means.
It's the humanitarian sector part, and
okay.
demining is what it says.
Okay.
And so I wanted an international nonprofit. I wanted a conservation story, but having been in the conservation world in the US, I wanted a story other than the ones I knew. And when I learned about the story in Africa, that was exciting. And so I followed those verticals, and I had my dead ends. I had a couple of stories where I'd work on it for like 3 weeks, and I just realized I was never going to emerge from that story, and so I'd back out. But that provided enough structure, and then with every one of those, I would interview 20 or 30 people to say, what's the best story inside this framework? And I had 4 criteria. Number 1 was it had to be broadly representative of a big sector, like Prague represented governments. It had to be cutting edge-ish. It had to be an interesting story, and it had to have interesting actors. And I had to somehow glean all of that over Zoom, which was really hard. And in the end, I took a chance. And I think that's why I was surprised so often, is that you just don't get the texture and the depth, and you don't get the time for people to say after 2 days, oh yeah, there's people in the city government who would like to end us.
Right. And those of us who've been writers and in journalism know that you can't put everything in the book or the story or the series that you hope to put in. I noticed, because this is connected to our program at Stanford, that there was, you mentioned in the intro, talking about one of my fellows alums, who is Paulette Brown Hines, who has brought GIS analysis to a project that she called Mapping Black California. And so were there stories like that that you were like, oh shoot, I can't get this one in, I just have too many to do?
Yeah, so Paulette runs a chain of black community newspapers, newspapers in black communities, and she does emphasize GIS really heavily, so I wanted to do that. I ran across a woman in Atlanta named Allie Kelly who has this brilliant idea. America needs to be able to move energy from renewable sources to the grid, and we can't. We don't have enough power lines. And she came up with this idea, well, we have all these interstate highways, so why don't we just use this land that we already have? And it was so simple, it's so elegant. It's getting a lot of traction in the upper Midwest, and I wished I could have written that. There were just a lot of people like that who didn't have whose stories weren't broad and deep enough.
Right. I wanted to ask you about the title of the book, The Geography of Hope, and it's about optimism, which we don't, I think, have enough of in the planet sometimes. Thinking about, and there was a great quote, which many people may know, from Noam Chomsky, which says, optimism is a strategy for making a better future. Because unless you believe that the future can be better, you are unlikely to step up and take responsibility for making it so. So why are these GIS folks around the world optimists?
A great question. I think that's the thing that drew me to them, is that because they work in a shared visual space, they believe they can show what change looks like. And they've had success doing it. They've mapped things as hard as sea level rise and bicycle paths and for cities, and their ability to add a data layer. The insurance example is a great one. Which houses have basements? Like, that helps solve the problem of how insurable are these homes? Where's there likely to be more risk? And because they work together in a medium that's visual, they have a real can-do attitude. It's not universal. I am generalizing and I am projecting. I went looking for stories to reinforce the thesis I had, and that's what I ended up writing about. So it's really important to me that, and I think as a community, when they get together, when 15,000 of them get together every year, they feel really good about themselves, for the most part. They may not feel really good about their bosses, but they feel really good about themselves and the work they do, and they believe they're doing something meaningful, and that they're doing something that not everybody can do, and it's true, and they feel underappreciated. They feel like people don't understand what they do, which is why I'm really happy that some of the early feedback I've gotten from the book is, oh, it wasn't about technology, thank you.
That's great. I think a last question from me, and then we're going to have a final poll, and then we're going to have questions. So if anybody in the audience or watching from home is considering a career in GIS, what advice would you give them?
Tons of jobs. It's always GIS and something else. It's GIS and conservation. It's GIS and agriculture. It's GIS and oceanography. It's GIS and something. But especially with the growth of AI, making GIS more available to lots of people. I would give this advice to anybody who's thinking about it as a career. I would give it to parents. There are lots of jobs in the world and more being created all the time, as opposed to those of us who are journalists, or were.
Okay. I think we have a poll? Yes, we do. Okay, this is the final poll for this evening. What use case excites you the most about GIS? And you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 options. So vote early and often. You can do that.
I'm really glad that none is not an option.
I like it's great. Okay, we're getting, it's like a little horse race. You watch these
So
lines
interesting.
going. Yeah. Okay, we're going to just let it run for a few more seconds here. Helping the environment and fighting disease spread
Interesting.
is really exciting.
GIS is you can't do conservation without GIS mapping.
Right. Empowering and informing citizens. It's the next one. That's great.
That's a transparency. That's transparency, right? And that's the chapter on policing. It's the chapter about Prague. It's also the chapter about education, because those K through 12 students can hear about something that they've read on TikTok in the news, and they can go into their classroom and learn about, well, what are tectonic plates? Why are there earthquakes in Turkey? Why, and what Jackie Black told me was that she's taken what used to be like 5-minute lessons where she'd put up a PDF and turned those into like 55-minute interactive sessions.
Great. Okay, you are a great group for questions. Thank you very much. We've got, okay, so let's start. What do GIS map makers wish was mapped that isn't mapped?
That's a great question. I'm sure that in their fields, they all have their own answers about that. But when they get together, 15,000 of them get together every year, like they have their own specialties. They're all represented. Some are cities. There's a whole ghost version, which is classified. I don't know what they wish they had. I think, for the most part, they're excited about AI because it's going to make the databases better and it's going to make the really laborious work better. Their challenge with AI is that they're not sure how much to trust it. And when you are charged with mapping a mission for an American fighter aircraft, are you going to trust AI to help you with that? What the intelligence agencies look for is change over time. They don't necessarily look for 2 fighter jets that just popped up on an airfield in Iran. They look for 38 more that joined those 2. You're going to trust AI to know how to do that? And so, I think one of the things they're wishing for is really reliable AI.
What is the oldest form of GIS you came across, maybe even the non-digital form? Mapping has been around for centuries. I figured there was something before.
As a practice, GIS has, I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it basically goes back to the 60s. It probably was being done.
You were talking about floppy disks, weren't you, earlier?
Yeah, so it goes back to the 60s. It may go back earlier than that. And when you look at how primitive that was at the time, and still to this day, one of the things that came up, I talked to the Halo Trust, which is the largest demining organization in the world, and they were talking about how they were using Excel spreadsheets in Afghanistan until they were able to put it all in GIS. Everybody talks about moving from spreadsheets to mapping. And so, I don't know when that was. There might have been some really early incarnation, but it takes a ton of computing power. So it can't be a whole lot earlier, I don't think.
What was the strangest thing you learned while doing this project? I like that question.
The strangest thing that I learned. some of the strangest stuff had to do with NGA and how NGA came about. And that had to do with the inner workings of America's intelligence community. And I learned that the CIA analysts who were brought in thought that working with the other agencies was not as sophisticated as they expected. And they kind of projected that. I wasn't ready for that. One of the things that was most surprising there were a couple of chapters where gender equity issues popped up, in explosives removal in particular. Until about 15 years ago, women basically weren't a part of the explosives world. It was a macho, military-dominated practice. And these women who were pioneers, who broke the glass ceiling, told me that they were shouted down in conferences just like a decade ago. And now in some countries, the majority of D miners, Sri Lanka comes to mind, the majority of D miners are women who are making a living. It's one of the few jobs they're actually encouraged or allowed to have. And the money that they're making gives them status, and it lets them start businesses. And that was true in the explosives world in a number of places.
So we were talking a bit about secrets in the intelligence community. Somebody asks, are there any stories about the intelligence community use of GIS that you can talk about?
It's not really a question of what I can talk about, it's what they can talk about. I interviewed one former director of NGA who really helped me understand the challenge that they face with this glut of data. And another expert said to me, when I said, well, how do I envision a classified use of this technology? And he said, well, do you use Waze? And I said, yes. And he said, you know that feature where it shows you where the police are? And I said, yeah. And he said, what if that was a tank that wanted to kill you? And I said, okay, I get it.
There we go.
That's how you use that, yeah.
Right. So we knew this would come up, which is, what about the privacy issues involved in mapping at this scale?
Yeah, so they're significant. And, it's like a lot of other privacy issues. It is up to the industries themselves to police what they gather and how they share it. And I think that and I've seen the codes of practice that a lot of GIS experts live by, and they have a lot of integrity. But at the end of the day, it's hard to believe that privacy exists much at all, right? When you think about the fact that the insurance industry has all of that data, when you merge that with your address files and you merge that with your credit card information and you merge that with your social media, what is it that the police won't know if they want to know? And I learned a lot about the technology the police departments have, everything from facial recognition. There was a story, I think, in the Times just last week about how they don't like to talk about it. They don't list that as one of the investigative methods, but facial recognition is widespread. License plate readers, radiation detectors. New York City is full of all of that. Lots of cities have a lot of those technologies as well. So I think there are significant challenges. I'm not an expert in that, but I do. James Fallows, who is a good friend of Esri, wrote recently that he talked about how there are lots of technologies in the world and none is inherently good, none is inherently evil. But on balance, the people who use GIS and deploy it seem to use it mostly for good. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book.
Okay. So there's a question here, does David have any observations on the global OpenStreetMap community?
Oh yeah, so the global OpenStreetMap community is people who do GIS who all come together for the common good. And they have maps of their own that they produce. They were critical during the Ebola response. I can't tell you how unmapped Western Africa was. One expert told me that in Liberia alone, there were 20 places that were referred to as Chicken Town. And so they got into a cab in Monrovia and Sierra Leone, sorry, and said to the cab driver, take us to Chicken Town. And they went to Chicken Town and dropped a pin for the map. And it was the OpenStreetMap community that worked nights to help build maps that let the infectious disease community figure out how to trace those cases of Ebola, because that was a brutal and gruesome disease. In its early days, it killed 80% of the people that contracted it in really brutal, awful ways. And created lots of culture clashes where these folks in these white suits, hazmat suits, were coming into villages and talking about why you can't embrace your departed dead relatives.
What about open source GIS?
Great question. So there are lots of open source GIS tools in the world. There are proprietary tools in the world. There are lots of organizations that use open source mapping. You know, everybody gets to decide what works best for them and where they're going to find the most reliable databases and the most support for what they do. You know, there's no point here where my job is to promote Esri. I happen to believe it's a really good community of users, and I've met some really terrific people through them. And there are people who choose Esri's technology. There are people who choose open source technology.
Is there a problem that's not currently being addressed that you think GIS could solve? Global warming?
There's lots of modeling around climate. I think the question is really about the reliability of the data. And I mean, the data all show the same thing. It's just a question of what people are going to do with it, and to the extent that politics gets in the way of science. But we all know that story. I can't say that I know any one thing in particular. It's a great question, and I will look into that.
Okay, good. So how is GIS being used in the war in Ukraine? There's actually some of our alums who are, like Bellingcat is doing some great work. Do you know of how GIS is being used? Yeah.
I know that NGA is giving Ukraine intelligence every day. And one of the challenges that NGA has, and the entire intelligence community has, is how intelligence has become open sourced. Do you remember at the very beginning when Russia invaded Ukraine, there were images of that 45-mile long line of Russian armor? Everybody, I see a lot of nodding heads for those of you online. And that satellite imagery, you know, was extraordinary, and it never would have been public 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And the intelligence agencies are having to cope with the fact that a lot of what used to be their domain of secrets is now public. And it was really fascinating to see how everybody that used to be an expert on infectious diseases and COVID instantly became an expert on military logistics when those pictures became public.
Right. What are the security measures in place to protect essential services, power, gas, et cetera, from people who want to turn mapping, hope, into a tool for hate?
The levels of security that the military has and intelligence agencies have is paramount. I mean, these are really important key ingredients in American intelligence, in warfighting. I'm going to guess that that stuff is as vulnerable when you look at things like power grids. That stuff's as vulnerable as the power grid itself. And I'm going to guess that that level of security depends a lot on the practitioners and how much money they're willing to spend on security and how good evil actors are.
Here's a nice one. I have a high school freshman who's positively gaga about geography. Go guy. How do I best support him in developing his interest and eventual career in the field?
While I said that I had a really hard time finding K-12 curriculum to write about, there are some places in the US where universities like James Madison have established really cool programs. But at the university level, there are tons of really good GIS programs. And
including Stanford, yes.
And so that's just a matter of looking and finding it. We have a dear friend in the Bay Area whose son went through a GIS program at the University of Redlands, not coincidentally where Esri is headquartered. But there are terrific GIS programs all over the world and plenty of ways for high school students to engage.
Is there the potential to create or increase inequities through the use of GIS tools with proprietary data?
Sure. Once you, I hate to keep coming back to the insurance example, but the former head of FEMA, Craig Fugate, told me that he thinks where the future might be headed is that the insurance industry is going to cherry pick individual houses on individual blocks. Not neighborhoods, not zip codes, and is that bad intent? Is that bad acting? Or is that just ensuring profitability? I think that communities are going to need more certainty than that. I don't think that an industry that decides to behave that way can be allowed to, but that certainly is where the future's headed. In Florida, a state agency was set up for people who couldn't get insurance. Living in New York, I know lots of people who have homes in Florida, and their insurance rates are just jaw-dropping. They're prohibitive. And the question is whether that's where the rest of the US is headed.
So we've got a couple questions that are related about mapping the oceans.
Yeah.
Are there any mapping applications used for our oceans? And they say, how are we supposed to find the aliens who have stations down there? I was unaware of that. The other question relating to it was about mapping. Can GIS help map debris and all the plastics in the ocean?
Yeah, so it can and it does, and usually through remote sensing. But Esri's chief scientist is a woman named Dawn Wright, who has a brand new book out called Mapping the Deep. I would recommend it highly. She is an oceanographer and is a terrific explainer of the uses of GIS underwater. The amount that we know about what's undersea now is just vastly greater than it was even 5 years ago. And, with the fact that oceans account for, 70% of the Earth's surface, something like that, it is really important that we understand what's there.
Great. Okay, we have lots of questions. Let's see. What is a unity map?
A unity map? The unity map was the map that all of the different community organizations in Bakersfield agreed upon. It was literally a unity map. And there were a bunch of different maps that were being considered in redistricting. Everybody, wants to carve up a city in a way that most benefits them. That's gerrymandering.
Right.
And what happened in Bakersfield is that there were 3 districts that were majority Latino, and there's a very large Sikh community in Bakersfield, and they were able to redistrict and keep that community mostly together, and that's what flipped the city council.
There's a couple of questions related here about making GIS data available. Do you think there are enough incentives for government to make GIS data available? And then there were a few journalists in the room who want to know how they could use it for their reporting.
Oh, it's a brilliant reporting tool. It's a great reporting tool. And I think lots of cities have GIS data online and available. And I think that as citizens, asking them to do that is a great thing to do. If you can't find those kinds of maps like flood zones or insurability or bicycle paths or paths for accessibility for folks with who are differently abled, if you can't find those maps for your city, you should ask for them. The city of Prague has all of those.
Okay.
If you ever really want to see what a full suite of maps looks like, just click on the English version, and there's a portfolio of maps there that's just outstanding.
Okay, last question, lightning round here. What's your next book?
I'm letting that come to me, just like I did the first one.
Okay. Thank you so much, David.
Thanks, Doc. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Don. Thank you, David. That was terrific. A couple things came to my mind as you were going through that. I moved here to Silicon Valley in 1976, and I was knocking on doors in this general vicinity as part of my first job. And I knocked on the door of the Burger King folks who were setting up Burger Kings in the Bay Area when the orchards were slowly being mowed down. And I asked them how they figured all those things out, and I was expecting something very sophisticated, and they just said, we just go wherever the McDonald's are and go next door. But I think you're absolutely right that my first read on this topic was a story about the discovery that was made in London of cholera, which was done by mapping and water and the patterns and things like that. So the level of sophistication that we're living with today is astounding, and you covered tremendous ground on that, and thank you so much for it. So let me thank our author and journalist panelists for their time tonight, and thank you all for coming. Great.
Thank you.